Hello, dear viewers of my channel. I'm glad to see you all in a new video. And today we will talk about the War of Japan with the USA through Japanese eyes. Enjoy watching. When a Japanese soldier sat down at a table in a small barracks somewhere in Yokosuka or deep inside the Imperial Naval Academy, the news was full of grandeur and destiny. In Beijing and Manchuria, Japanese flags flew, and in Tokyo and Osaka, people discussed the Great Mission, the expansion of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. But behind the facade of aggression and confidence, there lurked a troubling awareness. Japan's economy was starving for resources. Oil, rubber, metals, all of these were imported, and the American embargoes of the late 1930s and early 1940s were strangling Japanese industry and military plans. The decision to push further into deep expansion in Southeast Asia inevitably brought Tokyo into confrontation with Washington. This contradiction, the drive for a great empire and the awareness of vulnerability in the face of American power, shaped the psychology in which both supreme strategists and ordinary soldiers acted. On one side were military ideologues and political grandees, stubborn and willing to take risks. On the other were people who knew that if the U.S. entered the war in earnest, it would be a harsh test. Many Japanese realized this and were afraid. For ordinary sailors and aviators, the fear had a personal face. Before the strike group departed for Operation Z, commanders held meetings, technicians were rushed onto planes, young pilots were prepared for battle. Many tasted bitterness on their lips. It was not the trembling joy of victory, but the realization that they were undertaking something that could lead to an unprecedented war, in which victory would be almost impossible, the U.S. being the holder of bottomless resources and enormous industry. Officers, intellectuals sometimes wrote about their doubts in diaries. Many soldiers fell silent and obeyed orders as duty. Among the senior naval officers, the anxiety was even sharper. The chief architect of the strike on Pearl Harbor, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was a man of rare intellect and also a man who analyzed the enemy's strength coldly and dispassionately. In private conversations, he repeated, "For the first 6 to 12 months, I can operate without interference, and after that, our chances are almost gone." A warning that already expressed a sober understanding at the time. Japan had little time. Yamamoto understood that the strike had to be swift and crushing, to hit, immobilize the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and buy time for the lightning seizure of the resource territories of Southeast Asia, from which the war machine could be fed. At the same time, he understood the moral price of the strike. It would not end with fire and blood if America mobilized its industrial potential.
Everything was planned with military precision. 6 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku put to sea, hiding within a huge group of ships and under the cover of submarines and destroyers. Hundreds of planes were prepared on the carriers. The strike group had more than 400 aircraft at its disposal, of which 353 took part in the attack on Oahu. Torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters. The strike was delivered in 2 waves, calculated to first strike battleships and base facilities, and then finish off remaining targets and airfields. Japanese technicians adapted torpedoes for the shallow waters of Hawaii. Guns and bombs were selected to solve specific tasks. The entire operation was essentially at the limit of the Imperial Navy's capabilities. Approach range, secrecy, crew coordination, and speed of task execution. All of these decided the outcome. Dawn that Sunday morning was cold and quiet. For the pilots launching from the decks, the sea glittered like a mirror. They did not know that a few hours later the world would change forever. At the moment of attack, the first wave, having gained speed and altitude, headed for the targets, and when the scent of fuel and burning mixed with the sea air, catastrophe struck the decks of the American fleet. Dozens of planes were destroyed on the ground, ships caught fire, battleships exploded. In 1 hour, key units of the fleet were disabled and damaged. Scenes of success flashed for the Japanese in the rear, and pride for those who completed the task. The Japanese strike group numbered 6 carriers and carried about 414 aircraft in the armed group. 353 planes were directly involved in the attack on Pearl Harbor, sent in 2 waves. As a result of the strike, American losses amounted to approximately 2,403 killed and more than 1,170 wounded. Japanese losses were significantly smaller, dozens of planes and dozens killed. From the Japanese point of view, this was a triumph of skill. But already in ship logs and among the commanders, another understanding flickered. The strategic goal, to neutralize the American fleet forever, turned out to be unattainable in a single strike. Key assets like fuel depots and the U.S. Navy's aircraft carriers were spared. The main wealth of the American fleet simply were not in port at that moment. This omission later proved costly.
The first 6 months after Pearl Harbor indeed brought Japan a series of brilliant successes. The capture of the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, Singapore, and numerous Pacific islands. It seemed Yamamoto's plan was working. Resource zones were opened, and the Japanese empire gained space. But behind this visible victoriousness, systemic problems ran. First, Japan underestimated the U.S.'s capacity to mobilize production and to train pilots and crews. American factories reorganized assembly lines in a short time, and the volume of equipment output began to grow avalanche-like. Second, Japanese industry could not reproduce trained pilots at the same rate. Losses in aviation and at sea could not be replaced because there were simply no people to train. Third, key strategic blunders, including the loss of 4 carriers at Midway and the failure to destroy American carriers at Pearl Harbor, reduced the Imperial Navy's maneuverability. The Battle of Midway on June 4 through 6, 1942, became the turning point Yamamoto had foreseen in his gloomy words. American codes had been broken, and the U.S. fleet prepared a trap. As a result, Japan lost 4 of its carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with thousands of experienced pilots whose training required time and resources. This loss proved fatal for the continuing symbolic advantage of Japanese aviation and the fleet. American industrial power proved decisive. While the Japanese drew resources from conquered territories, the Americans were already expanding their fleet and air forces. Naval warfare became a war of attrition and production, and in that battle, Japan lost. For ordinary Japanese, the war became a catastrophe. Mobilization of men, shortages of food, bombings by American and British aircraft, destruction in cities, all this gave the sense of immersion in an unending tragedy. Women worked in factories from morning till night assembling equipment. Children were evacuated to the countryside, and the elderly waited for news of sons who did not return. When American bombings fell on Tokyo and other cities, fear became nationwide. For many soldiers and officers, there emerged an almost religious sense of doom. We did everything we could, they wrote in their diaries, but we had neither the time nor the material nor the industrial base to stand against the giant. These words are not rhetoric of defeat, but an acknowledgement of historical context. By mid-1944, Japan could no longer restore its former strategic initiative. Key resources were depleted, convoys were being sunk by American submarines, and economic pressure and aerial bombings turned industrial and civilian infrastructure into ruins. The U.S. decision to use new weapons, the atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 15 and 16, 1945, accelerated the end. For the Japanese, it was an apocalypse. An empire that tried to squeeze the maximum out of its early months faced total collapse. Surrender, to put it mildly, meant we lost. But behind those words were millions of human fates, soldiers, mothers, fathers, and children whose lives were torn to pieces. Post-war recollections of Japanese veterans are full of mixed feelings, from bitterness and shame to resignation and even pride in fulfilling duty. Many recounted how in the last days of the war, command begged for strength of spirit, while soldiers felt only emptiness and fatigue. Some officers admitted that the decision to enter an open war with the U.S. was a mistake. Others continued to justify it as necessary and duty. Isoroku Yamamoto foresaw the danger, but could not stop the machine set in motion by politicians and military interests. His grim phrase about 6 to 12 months became a kind of epitaph for Japanese strategy. First, rapid success, then an inexorable decline.